and welcome back to another episode of There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and in honor, I suppose, of Father's Day, we're going to be doing a story about a dad. Um, so let's get into this, shall we? Christopher Michael Benoit was born on May 21st, 1967, in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, to Michael and Margaret Benoit. He was one of two children with a sister, Lori. When Chris was 6, he was involved in a car accident where his head hit the windshield and he was hospitalized for 3 days with a potential traumatic brain injury. At 12, the family moved to Edmonton, Alberta. Peers reported that Chris was an easy-going guy who was a bit of a loner. Chris was known as a great athlete, either working out at home with his weight set that his father bought him or at Mr. C's gym. Michael reported, quote, he was pretty much driven from the age of 12, 13 to get into the wrestling industry. Chris lifted weights every day. He was 13 years old, breaking records in high school in our basement, end quote. In high school, he played football and wrestled. Classmates said he was a nice, kind guy. His idol at the time was, quote, the Dynamite Kid, end quote, Tom Billington, who was a professional wrestler. After he graduated from Archbishop O'Leary High School, he began to work at becoming a professional wrestler himself. Immediately, there was no other career path for this man. He continued to watch Tom's tapes and followed after him at 18. He was training at a location known as The Dungeon that was operated by Stu Hart. It's a fairly famous family within the wrestling community. On November 22nd, 1985, Chris had his first match in Calgary, Alberta, a tag team bout alongside the remarkable Rick Patterson. Chris went on to pin one-on-one his opponent, Butch Moffat, with a sunset flip. Early in his career, Chris went by Dynamite Chris as a nod to his idol. Chris also used Tom's diving headbutt and snap suplex as part of his moves, going on to win 3 more British Commonwealth Championships and 4 International Tag Team Championships. In 1987, Chris went to Japan to start touring their pro wrestling circuit. While he continued for a while with the name Dynamite Chris, he eventually put on a mask and changed his name to the Pegasus Kid. He went through several transformations and names at this time. Japan loved him, and he won the Best of the Super Juniors tournament in 1993 and 1995, along with other tournaments. During his time in Japan, he ended up with a match against Eddie Guerrero, in which he kicked him in the head and knocked him out. The two became close, and then they picked up another man, Dean Malenko, and the trio became known as the Three Amigos. After that, he began traveling all over the world. Chris Jericho said of him, quote, he was almost, I'd say, like the Michael Jordan or Wayne Gretzky of his profession. He was that good. He influenced many wrestlers all around the world for 22 years and almost kind of changed the style of pro wrestling in this country because he spent a lot of time in Japan and kind of integrated the Japanese style, the Mexican style, and the hard-hitting Calgary style into the WWE and the WCW, the former company he worked for, end quote. In June of 1992, Chris made his debut with the World Championship Wrestling, or the WCW, along with Biff Wellington. They were defeated. He came back to the WCW in January at a Clash of the Championships 22 and defeated Brad Armstrong. In 1994, Chris worked at Extreme Championship Wrestling and toured Japan. This is where he developed his nickname, the Crippler, after he accidentally broke Sabu's neck on November 2nd. Chris threw Sabu into a face-first pancake bump, but Sabu attempted to change direction, didn't get enough rotation, and landed on his neck. Eventually, this name morphed into the Canadian Crippler. In 1995, Chris was approached by Ric Flair, requesting he join the newly reformed Four Horsemen. Now, his professional life is kind of a tidy timeline. He goes through kind of these several wrestling arenas and venues and that are all popping up around in the area when the WWE's not either there or is just starting its kind of debut, and it's not as big, so there's not one central thing. But while his professional life is tidy, his personal one is a little bit off. What we know about Chris is he was married twice. First, sometime between 1980 and 1988, to a woman named Martina. While Chris was getting into the limelight, Martina preferred to stay kind of in the background area. We do know the couple had two children, a son David and then a daughter Megan. But then Chris met a woman named Nancy Sullivan, maiden name of Tofoloni, at a wrestling event where she did modeling and helped out. Nancy was married to another wrestler, Kevin Sullivan. Kevin and Chris were set to face off. And, these storylines all occur throughout wrestling. And so Kevin started a storyline that Chris actually stole Nancy from him. And in order to make it believable, had the two of them go out together, take photos as if they were together, and look like an actual couple. Of course, that means the two almost immediately began having a real affair. Martina found out and divorced Chris in 1997. Somewhere between 1998 and 2000, it sounds like 1998 from most of the sources, Chris ended up marrying Nancy. Their relationship appeared rocky from the start. In 1998, the couple got into an argument and Chris left the home, parking in front of his old house. There, he was found by police and questioned, when he stated he was simply reminiscing. Why is this important? Well, he was booked for a DUI. Still, the couple had a son together, Daniel, on February 25th, 2000. And this is where Chris began to enter into the WWE. Before that, he had been, again, like I had said, with all the other agencies. He had been with Japan, WCW, he was in the Canadian leagues. And Nancy managed Chris as he gained fame in the WWE. In 2001, Chris ended up having to have a neck surgery, and during recovery, the couple had another separation. Nancy reported that Chris continued to use his anabolic steroids and had no reason to do so while he was in recovery from the surgery, especially while taking other narcotic medications. That, at times, he would become quick to anger and throw things around the house. Chris, however, reported that he was worried about losing his size after surgery, and he didn't want any further setbacks from being in the WWE. Then on May 12th, 2003, Nancy filed for divorce, citing that the marriage was irrevocably broken and that Chris was cruel, that he threw things around and even had a restraining order on May 15th put in place. Nancy left the house with her son, stating that she feared for her and her son's lives. But 2 months later, they came to court together, reporting that they had patched things up and dropped the divorce proceedings and the restraining order. Both lawyers suggested that they go into couples counseling. And with that, in August, the family was back together. Okay, now kind of back to the career to help piece this all together. So Chris continued to use moves from other famous wrestlers, including the Hitman's finishing submission hold, known as the sharpshooter, using it to tap out Shawn Michaels at the Backlash in 2004. He won a massive ovation for this, and Nancy and Daniel were watching ringside. On November 13th, 2005, Chris lost Eddie Guerrero. Again, at this point, these two are best friends. Oh, Eddie died of heart failure just hours before he was supposed to compete at a WWE event. And when Chris found out, he screamed and was inconsolable. Medical professionals believe that this was a result of over drug use and steroids at the time, resulting in a weakened heart, which then caused the heart failure. Friends and family reported that Chris didn't cope well with the loss of his good friend, and over the next year, he ended up losing even more friends that he had wrestled with. This essentially lost him more to almost all of his support system. In May 2006, Chris went on a 4-month sabbatical from the WWE when Nancy ended up needing a neck surgery of her own. Chris also had a hernia repaired at this time. After, he told friends that he felt better than ever. Also talked about an unknown entity coming after him. He would change his route to the gym, checked his security cameras, wouldn't let Daniel play outside alone, and the entire family ended up moving into a new house. People that knew him believed that he had become overly paranoid. Then, in 2007, Chris was drafted to the ECW. Many considered this a demotion from the WWE. He was to help train those who were up and coming, rise through the ranks, slowly taking on more of a coach role than an actual player role. Essentially saving him from retirement, but getting him closer and closer to being out of the ring. On June 24th, he was supposed to win a match to set everything off, but he didn't show. On June 25th, 2007, the entire Benoit family was found dead in their home. During the investigation, it came to light that it was a murder-suicide. This is what we know of the events. On June 22nd, Chris was home after an event. He took Daniel next door to his neighbors for horse riding camp, then drove 40 miles to see his physician, Dr. Austin. He'd see Dr. Austin every couple months for routine checkups and refills of his prescriptions. There, he talked to his doctor about Nancy's moodiness. He endorsed feeling depressed and was subsequently prescribed Zoloft, a medication that takes about 3 weeks to build up in the system and see any effects. Then he called friend Bob Holly. He complained that Nancy was acting like Hitler, but they were making it work, and even asked Bob to come visit, as he was less than a half-hour away. But Bob declined. He wanted to rest himself and see his own family during his time off. After that, Chris met up with Ray Rolls, paying him for a tailored outfit. Ray had been a tailor with the WWE, but had been kicked out after being convicted of exposing himself to a child. Still, Chris and he remained semi-close, and he continued to support Ray. When he returned home, he called and talked to Chavo Guerrero, one of his travel partners. He also spoke with Nancy, who was out grocery shopping at the time. They talked about what they needed for the barbecue that was coming up. Next, he called a car dealership about selling one of his vehicles, and last he called a pool service company to come out and service the pool at his home. The company came out that afternoon and later would go on to tell police that there was nothing out of the ordinary. Chris was outside grilling with Daniel while they were there. At 9:25 p.m., a call came from inside the house and was made to an operator requesting the Fayetteville police, and they were given the non-emergency number. That number was never dialed. 7 minutes later, 3 calls were made to the next-door neighbor. 2 of them were one after the other, and the other one I think was closer to 10 p.m. But the neighbor didn't answer any of them, and no voicemails were left. At some point, Nancy was unfortunately bound by her wrists and ankles in a room upstairs where Nancy usually watched TV. An electrical cord was wrapped around her neck. Chris put Nancy on her stomach, put a knee in her back, and pulled on the electrical cord. There were signs of a struggle in the room, and Nancy had suffered from a contusion on her head and bruising throughout her body, suggesting that she surely fought back. After Chris killed her, he wrapped her body in a blanket and placed a Bible next to her. The next morning, Chris called next-door neighbor at 8:30, asking if Daniel was supposed to attend horse camp again, stating that, unfortunately, Daniel wouldn't make it as he really wasn't feeling well. But it was because Chris went into Daniel, who was 7 years old at this point, and strangled him. Xanax would later be found in his system, suggesting he was drugged prior to being murdered. Chris placed a Bible next to him as well. Chris then went on to call Michael Parker at 1:57 p.m., leaving a voicemail. Chris was returning a call to talk office politics, but Michael would later report Chris was rambling and slurring his words throughout the voicemail. At 3 p.m., the neighbor called Chris back, and they talked for approximately 10 minutes. Chris told her that Daniel was suffering from food poisoning, and he felt really bad that he couldn't do anything for him. Chris also said Nancy was suffering from the same issues, and they were laying low while they recovered. The neighbor basically implied that he was trying to convince her not to come over and check on them. At 4 p.m., Chris then got on the internet and got on to a Wikipedia article of the prophet Elijah. Chris continued to make calls to wrestling colleagues, including Chavo, in which Chris stated he couldn't make it to the event that night as his family was too sick, saying, "Chavo, I love you," which was out of pocket for Chris, prompting Chavo to call back later that evening to make sure he was okay, and reminded him to make it to the live event the next day. At 6:10 p.m., he reported being unable to attend the house show to one of the representatives at the ECW because his family was in the hospital. They were very sick. Between 3:51 and 3:58 a.m., Chavo and referee Armstrong received a series of texts from Chris and Nancy's phones. They were out of character for either of them. One of them was the address of their home. Another was that the dogs were locked up in the pool garage. After that, Chris hanged himself with a cord from his lat pull-down machine in the home's basement gym. Chris died at 40 years old. After representatives of the WWE couldn't get a hold of Chris, they called in a welfare check on Monday, and that was how the family was found. Police wanted to determine if it was the result of steroid use. Autopsy results showed that Chris had 10 times the amount of testosterone in his system, indicating he had been using a large amount of steroids just prior to his death, though that is not conclusively considered the reason for the murder-suicide. Its use may have played part. Texts prove that Nancy wanted Chris off steroids, which did cause contention. His inability to perform in bed was another, but again, this is related to the overuse of steroids. Nancy also believed that Chris had been cheating on her while he was on the road, though that information cannot be substantiated. All of the stressors and his difficulty managing his emotions unfortunately led to the murder of Nancy and Daniel. And I did talk about in the very beginning that he had a TBI, so they did an autopsy and ruled that he didn't have any factors that would have changed his mentation, like we sometimes see or hear about in other killers that have had substantial head injuries, but is why I added it in the beginning. And with that, that is the end of the case of the Canadian crippler, Chris Benoit, and the senseless murder of his wife and son. To all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.